Hi everyone, I'm Joe. Today it's time for me to do my favourite books of 2021. 2021 was a good reading year. I read a very interesting and varied selection of books, most of which were really good. Obviously there were some bad ones there, but there were also some extremely good ones. Obviously the point of this video is to talk about those that really stood out to me, and indeed that is how I chose them. I just went through a list of all the books that I read throughout the year, and essentially when my eyes looked at a book and they sort of lit up, and I thought, oh, I remember that one, that was exceptionally good. I was like, right, that's a book for my favourites of the year video. So it's not much of a debate with these books. These are just ones that really stood out to me. There happens to be 10 of them, and without further delay I will get talking about them. Oh, and I will talk about the honourable mention of the year first, and that is the Vampire Knitting Club series written by Nancy Warren. This is an ebook series that I read from the early in the year till about 3/4 of the way through the year. I read these due to Rachel Canardi. She was having quite a lot of fun reading them because they were light and easygoing. I tried them, and indeed they are definitely that. The concept of them essentially is a American woman, a young American woman, comes back over to England when she gets told that her grandma has died and she has inherited her knitting shop in Oxford, England. So she comes over and also discovers, as well as the knitting shop she's inherited, she also has kind of inherited, of sorts, the fact that there is a vampire knitting club in the back room of the shop. Bit of a surprise to her, but she gets used to it. And obviously every book essentially is, there is some kind of crime that's happened, normally a murder, and the Vampire Knitting Club and her, they have to basically get involved and solve whatever the crime happens to be. You know, they're light, fun, and they're just enjoyable to read between other rather more intense books. Indeed, the first of those slightly more intense books, although it's not as intense as some, was Ambiguity, Machines and Other Stories, written by Vandana Singh. This is a science fiction short story collection, although some of the stories in it are close enough to fantasy though. And this is one that I really obviously enjoyed, and it's been on this list. Each story has got interesting concepts. Now I'm not going to talk about individual stories. One, I can't remember individual stories of most of them, but I do remember thinking afterwards, wow, they were amazingly well written, they were nuanced, they had interesting characters, and what Singh is creating with these characters, and indeed the concepts over very short stories, was really quite exceptional. And I was really impressed by the book and indeed the author, and I would definitely read more by her in the future, because this may be the first novel that I read by her, but it won't be the last, because this was well worth reading. The next book that I read and I thought was truly exceptional was The Invincible, written by Stanislaw Lem. Now this is one, actually no, not one of the, this is the oldest book in this video, written multiple decades ago, and the idea of this is quite simply, there is a large spaceship going to a planet to investigate what happened to its sister ship, which is nearly identical to it. This sister ship went to this planet and it hasn't been heard of again. You know, no communication, no radio, nothing. So this ship is going there a little bit apprehensive, because if something can take out or destroy or somehow silence a big ship which is nearly identical to it, then couldn't that happen to it as well? It's an interesting journey that the crew have to make on this planet. It's a very curious planet, and it's done, I mean, this is a Polish author translated into English, so translated work as well, and it's an interesting concept and slightly like an alternative view than a lot of, sort of mainstream either UK or American authors, which is the majority of what I read, frankly. So it's got a slightly alternative view, and one that I really did appreciate overall. Next up we have The Relentless Moon, written by Mary-Robinette Kowal. This is the third novel in the Lady Astronaut series. The first two books are part 1 and 2, following the same character. This is not following that character, it's following the character that the main character in those two meets and talks to. The overall concept is actually quite simple in theory, and that is that there has been a large meteor or asteroid, I never know what the difference between talking about them, has hit the Earth and destroyed and done enormous damage. One of the places it's destroyed is Washington DC, the capital of America, and it's devastated the coastline and other coastlines around the world, obviously with massive waves and things. And it's also triggered what will be eventually a new ice age, which means humanity won't be able to survive on Earth, or at least not very easily. So this happens in the 60s, there's a space program, and indeed this is an alternative timeline to now, where we've had to adapt and try to advance their technology at a much faster rate due to survival. And the need for astronauts is quite high, hence lady astronauts or female astronauts actually being accepted eventually, still with a lot of sexism and a lot of issues, but people do realise that actually there's no real difference. Females can do just as good a job as, shockingly, the men. Certain characters have to learn. So it's interesting, that book. It's based around different characters from the first two, and I don't want to talk about the plot, but let's just say it really is worth reading because it's got fantastic characters and an interesting viewpoint on the world, and indeed, obviously the issue between male, female, patriarchy, and frankly a lot of sexist idiots thinking that men are for some reason all powerful, when actually normally it's the women that actually get these seriously interesting ideas and actually do a lot of the important work. Men just like take credit for all of that work, as the case may be. Then the next book is Rosewater, written by Tade Thompson. This is a book that I really enjoyed purely by itself. It does actually have 2 sequels to it. It is the first in a trilogy. However, the first book stands out to me 10 times more than the second and third, because there's just something about this first book. The principle is quite simply, there is a large alien entity that is sort of partially buried in the earth, happens to be in Nigeria. The people there have start making essentially a town around it. The town is called Rosewood, and it's about what this alien entity affects with humanity. It seems to create a very weird healing effect on some people, but it also mutates other people in a horrific and fairly lethal way in others. It also unlocks psychic abilities in certain characters, and indeed in this first book, one of the characters is a psychic character who is used by a government agency to try and find out, obviously the thoughts and the sort of thought processes of certain individuals. It's a curious book. Obviously, being Nigeria, it's an interesting setting and not one that you come across, at least personally, I don't come across too often. And it's one that I would really recommend reading. You don't have to read the second and third books as well. This does stand alone by itself. It ends in an interesting enough way, but yes, it leaves a little bit of a few little questions open, but third other books that don't have sequels, so you could definitely read this by itself and be quite happy with it. The next book is an ebook, and that is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, written by Kingfisher. Now this is actually one of only 2 novellas on this list, although for the purposes of saying what my favourite books were, I am not distinguishing between novellas and actual full-length novels, because yes, obviously there's a reasonable difference in length, but they're still long enough that it took me a while to read and indeed a while to think about. And A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking is certainly one that made me think, because it was just so enjoyable. This is a essentially a sort of fantasy kingdom where the magic users in it have very specialised areas which they do not choose. They just happen to, when they come into their sort of magical power, they happen to find they have a speciality in a certain way. This young woman happens to find that her speciality is basically to do with baking, basically dough. So she creates, from amongst others, the walking gingerbread men and a large dough monster in the basement, as you do. And this is a situation which comes in handy when, for instance, there happens to be people that do not like the magic users and they want to get rid of all magic users. And let's just say this presents problems when there are some quite significant magic users around, including the main character, and it just goes from there. I don't want to say too much because it is relatively short by most standards, but it's just really enjoyable. The characters are great, the setting is fun, and I really enjoyed this. This just made me smile when I was reading it. I mean, it certainly has its darker moments, so it's not something like fluffy fantasy novel. I mean, fantasy novels often have some pretty extreme darks in them, and this is certainly no exception. But she knows how to run the balance between the lighter moments of fantasy and the very dark moments, and this is done very, very well indeed. The next book that I loved and found exceptional in 2021 was Glass and Gardens Solarpunk Winters, edited by Sarena Ulibarri. Now, this is actually the second short story collection edited by Ulibarri. The first one, which has got the same first part of the name, the Glass and Gardens, but that is called Solarpunk Summers, was, I believe, one of my favourite books several years ago, and now its second and companion one is actually my favourite book of the year again. This seems to work for me. Now, the idea of Solarpunk is a very specialised subgenre. It is essentially considered very sort of hopeful and optimistic, but with a specific focus on renewable energy sources. Basically, normally a world in which we're going now, where all natural resources have run out, or at least are in massively short supply, and things have gone wrong, and now we're trying to learn to live with less natural resources. So renewable and alternative product and material sciences are coming to the fore, and this is an interesting short story collection by mostly authors that I have never heard of before, for the most part. I think there was like one that I remember before, but each story is really, really interesting and well written, with some really interesting ideas. I mean, I don't know what to expect with this collection when I went into it, same as the first one, but it's just something about it that just really gets me and just pulls me in, because they're just well written, and the editing done by Ulibarri and the sort of selection of stories is just really impressive as well. I mean, this is a great collection, one that I would really recommend, especially if you want to try to get into this very niche subgenre. It might be a good place to start with its companion novel. The next book that I really enjoyed throughout the year was Velocity Weapon, written by Megan E. O'Keefe. This is the first in a trilogy called The Protectorate, which is written on the side as well. I love it when on the side. I love it when trilogies have the trilogy name on the spine. I know obviously they can only do that generally when the trilogies or series has been ongoing. If you've written a book and you don't know if it's going to be a trilogy, then you can't do it. Anyway, this is a really good one, pretty sure you class as a space opera novel. This is an interesting one because it starts off with the main character waking up on a ship, injured, like really badly. She's actually literally lost her leg, and naked on a spaceship alone. And the spaceship is a sentient AI spaceship as well. So, it's an enemy sentient AI spaceship. So it's a curious concept from the very start, and let's just say it goes in very interesting directions in the course of this book and indeed two sequels, and I just really enjoyed it. It had a very interesting and fun plotline. Yes, it has its dark moments, but it has its light moments as well. It has really interesting characters, especially the interactions between the thoughts between the main character and the other sort of one of the other main characters who happens to be related to her, happens to be a brother who wants to actually find her. And this is an interesting book with some really great plotline, and it's just a very involving book. I mean, I went through this remarkably quickly, and it's 2 sequels because it just got me involved, and I just read them really fast in one go, and I really did enjoy them overall. The next book that I'm going to talk about is, and this is not going to be a surprise because I've talked about this author before and his books have really stayed with me, is A Master of Jin, written by P. Djeli Clark. This is one of the first novel in the Dead Djinn universe that he has created. For the record, he has actually now officially agreed with his publisher that he will write several more novels set within this universe, which I'm very much all for because this was simply fantastic. It's a relatively short novel by some standards, but the shortness of it certainly doesn't detract from it in any way. Obviously, the author, Clark, knows how to get to the point. He also knows how to go into little asides about characters and character development, which is frankly lovely to see, and frankly really impressive to see as well. This is a version of the first book was set in Cairo. It's set around Cairo and the area where essentially it's a universe where it's very much Earth, but one where magic of a sort exists in the form of jinns and magical beings that obviously we hold in legend ourselves in that part of the world. Indeed, every country has its own mythology. In this, it's not mythology, this is actually real, and they provide powers and abilities. And you have an agency that is trying to deal with the issues that arise from this. And the main character, who is actually the main 2 characters are female as well, which is interesting because obviously in this setting, the patriarchy obviously exists. Male sexism blatantly exists really heavily, just as it sadly does in our real world. So the fact that the main 2 characters are female is interesting. And there's another female character who knows those 2 characters, who isn't even what she seems as well. So this is a very interesting novel with brilliant characters, a beautifully detailed world, and it's a little bit different because the setting not being European or American. So one that I really did enjoy overall. The next book that I really loved and I've definitely got to talk about here is 6 Weeks, written by Mur Lafferty. The concept of this is actually quite simple in theory. This is essentially a generation ship. The crew of the generation ship is 6 people, unsurprisingly, but it's the same 6 people again and again. Basically, 6 people have been selected. If anything happens to them, like an accident or whatever, and one of them gets killed, essentially they get brought back to life, essentially in a form of a new clone. So it's clones. Hence the wakes. The wakes are the new clone coming awake, becoming alive, and carrying on. Fortunately, at the start of the novel, several clones wake up at the same time. One of the clones, instead of a nice, clean, cloning bay, there's tons of blood all over the place, and there's blood all over the ship, and everywhere's a mess. So obviously, this is a closed system. There's only 6 of them, or at least there were 6 of them awake. So obviously, one of the previous clones must have killed somebody, or killed everybody, or killed themselves, or tried to destroy the ship. Nobody knows. So this is a closed room mystery aboard a generation ship with clones of characters. It's a really curious concept, one that I really enjoyed. It's a science fiction mystery, and a really well written one at that, which I just enjoyed every moment of this novel. I mean, I am really glad that I finally got around to this. I've been wanting to read it for about at least 2 years, and I finally got hold of a physical copy with great difficulty, I might add. For some reason this is very difficult in the UK, I mentioned that before, and I'm just happy that I read it because this was frankly fantastic. And the last novel is a ebook, and that is Elderweight, written by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is actually a novella, the second of the two that I mentioned earlier, and one that I really enjoyed. Now, the idea of Elderweight is actually quite clever because it is a science fiction novel that reads like fantasy. Basically, there is a woman in a seemingly fantasy kingdom who has a problem that she has to deal with because she's of the royal line. Basically, there is a new demon or demonic type creature, monster, nobody really knows exactly, roaming a certain area, and she has to go and basically deal with it. But she goes and gets the help of the local, sorcerer, or at least what they think of as the sorcerer, who is this strangely long-lived person in this rather interesting environment, let's say. I mean, the science fiction part comes into play there, frankly. I mean, that's not going to be a spoiler. And she goes to this individual and asks them for help. They do indeed agree to help, and they go off to deal with an apparent demon. Nothing is ever quite as it seems. Everything is written in a way that you never quite can predict what's going to happen, because you think this is a science fiction novella, but it's not reading like one. It's reading like fantasy, but also not. It's a weird hybrid, and one that I really enjoyed overall, and I would really heavily recommend. And with that said, that is actually it for all of my favourite books of 2021. If you have read any of these, or you would like to, then please leave a comment and we can have a talk about it. Or if you just want to know more information about any of these, then I'll try to answer as best as I'm able. Please let me know any standout books or any favourite books of the year that you had as well. I'm always interested to get into new authors, new subgenres, and really basically just read great books, obviously. Or if you have any suggestions based on books you think I might like based on these, then again, leave a comment, because frankly, who doesn't want to read more books, especially interesting ones? And all the links to these will be found in the description box below. And that is it. So I hope everybody else had a good reading year. Hopefully, I predict 2022 will also be equally good, if not even better. And that said, that is it for this video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you another day. Bye for now.